George K. Wood. 5. While I get email from time to time asking for more sophisticated information for advanced players, the vast majority of messages come from handicappers whose ability ranges from beginner to somewhere in that big area best labeled less than expert. And remember the definition of expert: someone who seems to know a little more than you do, lives more than 50 miles away, and uses slides. Much of this series was inspired by the handicapping classic, Ainsley's Complete Guide to Thoroughbred Racing by 6. Tom Ainsley. It's one of the few books on racing that contains ideas that weather the passing of time very well, with few becoming totally outdated. The Big Four. I love the term that Ainsley uses to describe where all handicapping should begin: the fundamental launching pads of handicapping. 1. Suitability to distance. The simple truth is that the winning range of most horses is severely limited. Each year, there certainly are a few superstars who can romp in sprints and also stretch out to dominate in routes as well. But these are truly the exceptions to the rule, and most will be found in the best of the best races. It's easy to forget to ask yourself if a trainer has entered a horse into a race purely as a freshener that will not include any type of real effort. 7.2. Condition. For many, the most challenging part of the handicapping puzzle. Form cycles don't conform to consistent, easy-to-spot patterns. Obviously, recency is an important factor. Workouts, usually for better horses, combined with trainer stats should be used when necessary. Yes, that's another judgment call that varies from player to player. Running lines and running trouble, forgivable or not. No single answer is correct, and what works best for you can only be determined by keeping records, something that most players simply will not do. That's amazing, because it's one of the most valuable edges you can have. 3. Class. Here's one where Ainsley and I part company. He says that the purse is not the thing. I disagree. In these days where purses at many tracks are supplemented by slot machine revenue, driving up purses way beyond what they had been at the same class level for prior years, the purse is the thing. No longer is a $10,000 claimer at track A roughly the equivalent of a $10,000 claimer at track B. Also, the class within class phenomenon, that is, non-winners of N8 races, once found only at cheap tracks, appears regularly on the major circuits. For casual to less than expert players, I have no hesitation in recommending the use of purse values to determine the class of horses and the class of race more than traditional claiming values. Horse players who have used traditional claiming values in combination with average earnings for many years may find this difficult to accept. Special note: Post Time Daily, the original online past performances website, is the only source I know of that includes the purse value for all claiming races in the PPs. Their powerful software is free. You can find them online at www.posttimadaily.com www.posttimadaily.com. 4. Suitability to today's racing surface/track bias. Fortunately, one of the easier but still very important launching pads that can help 9 handicappers to keep or throw out horses as contenders. Easier, because players have access to much more information today than in years past to determine the likely answers to these ponderables. We'll look at each of these factors in each of these categories in detail in this 4-part series. To be sure, nothing dramatic or revelatory in nature, but a good, solid review of the ideas that no successful handicapper of any caliber can overlook. 10. Without a doubt, assessing current racing condition is the toughest challenge facing any handicapper. Read 20 books on handicapping and you'll find 20 different ways to handicap condition. No wonder beginners, and even many regular players, are confused when they encounter this handicapping factor. Let's look at some of the most popular and most important concepts that come under the umbrella of the condition factor, and try to formulate a workable conclusion to handle it. Recent action. Just as it's a truism that favorites win a third of all races, so is it a truism that 2/3 of all races are won by horses whose most recent start was within a couple of weeks of the winning race. But this is no big deal, simply because 2/3 of all horses that go to the post have had 11 a race within 2 weeks. This, according to Ainsley, applied as far back as 1968, over 40 years ago. Workouts. It seems to me that the most regularly repeated comments one can overhear in casual conversations at the track or OTB made by regular players are variations of "workouts don't mean nothing," or "you can't trust workouts." In Ainsley's book, Remember, published in 1968, Tom lists 8 specific ways a trainer can manipulate a workout to be misleading. What are they? 1. Weighing down the horse with a heavy exercise buoy or adding lead weights to the saddle pad. 12. Using heavy bandages to slow a horse's stride and slow the horses down, although it does strengthen the horse's physique. 3. Exercising late in the morning. Ainsley contends that a later workout is run on a surface that may be chewed up thoroughly by the hooves of all the horses that worked out earlier. 4. Telling the rider to place the horse in the middle of the track until it has completed the turn into the home stretch, a deliberate loss of ground that adds time to the workout. There's no noting of this in the past performances. 5. Instructing the rider to maintain as tight a hold as possible, making it harder for the horse to breathe and slowing him down unnaturally. 13.6. Night workouts not allowed on big tracks. Ainsley suggested that this was a favorite tactic on certain smaller racing circuits. Is it still true today? Does anyone really know? 7. Working the horse out elsewhere, causing no workouts to appear in the past performances. 8. An admitted rarity, disguising the horse so that the clockers do not recognize it. This can involve the use of blinkers, a non-standard saddle cloth, different color than the stables, and bandages wraps that it does not need. This is not to say that all workouts are to be construed as being intentionally misleading. However, the smart thing for a handicapper to do is to consider the frequency and length of workouts leading up to a race, especially after a layoff, rather than the published times. If you were to take, say, half a dozen trainers whose winning style impresses you and keep a notebook on their racing/workout regimen. 14. You will probably have better information and understanding of the condition factor after one season than 90% of your fellow players. And at smaller tracks, this can be dynamite. Layoffs. Perhaps the most mysterious of all sub-factors making up the condition factor. More expensive horses can take time off, as their training regimen consists of being prepped at private farms, where workouts and current condition are known only to close connections. Cheaper horses are laid off for reasons of injury, of course, and by smarter trainers simply when an animal needs rest. Again, keeping personal records, which by their nature must be more detailed and current than even today's sophisticated computer-generated trainer data, is the key to this puzzle, if you're one of the few players who are willing to go this extra mile. 15. It's really annoying to see an animal that hasn't raced in a full year, or two, in some rare cases, come back to the races and win at first asking. While the tote board may tell you someone is betting heavily on him, which can lead to a lemming stampede by puzzled bettors who want to hedge their bets, common sense seems to tell you a win is unlikely. Best approach: pass the race. Without your own superior records, this is gambling, not handicapping. Form reversals. The most memorable overheard comment by players is, "How could that horse win? This race was fixed." Granted, some may be right, whether the fix was an out-of-the-movie's plot, or creative use of contemporary chemicals, if you know what I mean, and I think you do. However, many seeming reversals of form are nothing more than a trainer skillfully or accidentally placing his horse into a race in which the horse holds several edges. 16. All the same time, class, speed, or pace, and condition, even when it looks like he is competing against similar horses that have beaten him regularly. Many players simply do not want to overlook a horse's last race if it was bad, or take the time to determine if the horse simply didn't belong in it. I've had the good fortune, after lots of hard work, to catch a couple of these. The most outstanding was a cheap claiming race at Little Fauner Park, Grand Island, Nebraska, in which a horse was raced into shape for 3 races, the last of which had adjusted speed and pace ratings, made by me, that showed after the track variant was factored in, the horse, who finished 7th in a 10-horse field, had had a major tune-up and was ready to roar. He was nailed at the wire by the favorite, but the $2 exacta, with him running second at over 100 to 1, returned $729. Others at my table muttered, "Fix," but I knew why that horse ran as well as he did. There was no fix, no chemical enhancement. And I mention this in detail to demonstrate that it takes work and that you won't find bets like this every day. 17 but even once in years is enough, not just for bragging rights, but as reinforcement that you can win at the races. Deciding whether a horse is running over its head can largely be a part of those personal records I referred to above. With today's super-inflated purses for ultra-cheap horses at tracks where slot machine revenue pumps up purses, your own records are what tells the truth and makes it somewhat easier from a form point of view to have a better handle on condition. Cheaper and better horses. Better horses keep their form longer than cheaper ones. Workout patterns, coupled with trainer records, usually tell the story if better animals returning from layoffs can pop first time or need a tune-up or two, like their less well-bred claiming friends. 18 Form cycles. You've seen horses that can hold their form for a long time, as evidenced by their PPs. But what about the ones who go in and out of condition in erratic patterns? The ones that can win a couple in a row, then seemingly win here and there with no discernible pattern? Certainly the class factor comes into play, and juggling class and condition in races like these is a fabulous example of what makes handicapping an art and not a science. From a condition point of view, I look for a horse that flashed early pace or stayed fairly close to the pace in a race following a couple of lackluster, even, or worse performances. This is a sign of improvement that must be used by a trainer within a race or two. I love second and third starts after layoffs. The mutuals are usually better than you might think. Of course, this is not an automatic spot play, as we're only talking about one handicapping factor. But it can be a great point to start, depending on your circuit. 19 Conclusion. Certainly, this is an abbreviated and cursory look at the condition factor. How you put it all together. The most sensible approach seems to be made up of several points. 1. Don't be bound by traditional maxims that include automatic cut-off time periods as strict elimination guidelines. 2. Try to keep personal, detailed racing/workout records even if just for a few trainers at tracks you like to play. 3. Do not ignore the factor of condition, but regard it as one of the most iffy parts of handicapping. 24. Accept the reality that the condition factor must be judged more subjectively than many other handicapping factors. For many players, the reality is that this factor is at best educated guess. Simply realizing this will help keep your overall focus and performance in balance. And at worst, it affords a wonderful excuse when it's tall tale time with your handicapping buddies. 21. In part 1 of the series, looking at the first fundamental launching pad of handicapping, I quoted Tom Ainsley as saying the winning range of most horses is severely limited. Let's start this part of the series with a reminder for seasoned players and an important fact for newcomers that illustrates more precisely what this means. Horses that compete and win 6 furlongs races may always be runners-up at 7 furlongs. A router who can win at 1 1/16 miles may have a running style such that it simply cannot run faster when it shortens up to a mile, and never wins when matched with true mile runners. Many players forget that trainers are simply not trying to win each and every race in which they enter their horses. A sprinter who wins and 22 then tails off may come back from a layoff with a sprint followed by a rout. If the post-layoff race shows anything early speed for a fraction, a real move between segments later, the route race is probably not the crackdown race, but another conditioner to ready the horse for a suitable sprint next time out. How do you know? Highly detailed commercially produced trainer records may be helpful. The best records are those you keep yourself, since they help you to learn specific patterns that stay with you. Great stuff if you play a circuit on which trainers move around. But records, including the records within a horse's past performances, must be tempered with reality. As we enter the spring of the year when younger horses are tested at different distances for the first time, how do you handle the distance factor? 23. Unless you decide to really become a specialist, using pedigree and breeding information coupled with well-proven records of trainer habits, and even then, a bet remains an educated guess. Betting horses that have not developed any type of record at a distance is risky business. What is any type of record at the distance? To keep it simple, many players use a finish within 2 lengths of the winner. Let's look at a couple of common situations and the ultimate answer to the distance factor. Sprinters in route races. Occasionally you will find a sprinter who runs fast early in his sprints but always seems to cough it up in the stretch or just before entered in a route. Will he take the lead and go all the way in a race that is supposed to have a slower pace? I say no, and bet against such horses. Such animals win from time to time but most lack the stamina it takes to make the distance change. If I bet races with horses 24 stretching out, I much prefer sprinters who consistently run mid-pack and finish evenly, that is to say, who don't quit in the stretch. Sometimes, these horses surprise even themselves by taking the lead and being rated well enough to go all the way. But insist on good odds. Rooters in sprints. I almost always throw these types out. I especially like to see big horses from last year getting ready for this year's campaign entered in pricey allowance sprint races. They're mostly tune UPS for upcoming races, and yet because of what appears to be a class edge, they often go off as favorites, false favorites. 25 Because the distance factor is entwined with such factors as speed and class, the challenge of analyzing it in detail for specific situations is a tough one. The bottom line may seem like a cop-out to some, but the reality of racing today provides a simple solution. Pass the race. Simulcasting has changed racing in many ways. With the huge number of races available via simulcasting, there is no need to waste time on races in which the distance factor is a major issue for you. Bypassing such races is not an admission of weakness. Removing the distance factor by sticking with races filled with confirmed sprinters or rooters lightens the handicapping load. Anything that makes picking winners at prices easier is a blessing. 26. Class in thoroughbred horse racing has been defined in many different ways because it is, as Ainsley said, easy to recognize and hard to define. Class truly encompasses many other handicapping factors, such as speed, pace, ability, horse sense in the literal meaning of the expression, and more. Perhaps the simplest way to define class is to say that it is a horse's competitive will to win as demonstrated by its racing record and or style. Certainly, at least part of a horse's class is quantifiable, as seen in the prices assigned to claiming horses. All other things being equal, a $10,000 claimer should easily beat a field of $5,000 claimers, and in turn, be facing the behinds of most of the field when facing $25,000 claimers. 27 But as you know, most of the time all things in racing are not equal. Andy Bayer's part times for the most part clearly demonstrate that classier horses run faster than cheaper ones, and this is certainly a valid way of measuring class among the claimers. James Quinn's fine work, The Handicapper's Condition Book, in both its original form and revised edition, is one of the best sources for beginners and seasoned pros alike who wish to review the class factor, especially as it applies to the better animals that race in allowances, stakes, handicaps, and graded races. Let's review some common situations that have been around for years, but which must be examined in view of the present state of racing today and put aside the sometimes conflicting claims that spring from studies of various databases. 28 Class races. In claiming races, I usually assume a trainer is running a horse over his head primarily to race it into condition unless the horse showed a sign of improvement that can be the tip-off to a peak effort coming up. Specifically, I look for uncharacteristic speed early in the race or a noticeable gain in the stretch. I restrict this to older horses, 4 and up. 3-year-olds are truly developing animals and are often subject to spurts in development that are tough to detect. If you play just one track or circuit, keeping a notebook for the various claiming levels will tell you after a few weeks if there is any real class difference between adjacent levels of horses. At some bull rings, for example, $2,500 and $3,500 horses are virtually the same group, running 1 week for one price and the next at the other. 29 Class drops. I generally discount horses that are dropping in class from win consideration unless they are being handled by one of the top trainers at the track who I know, from records, is smart enough to know when he's been placing a horse into races that are just a bit too tough. Why? Because you don't take a horse that has proven it can win at a certain level and offer him for sale at a much cheaper price unless the horse's ability or health is in question. It really is that simple. Yeah, George, but what if the trainer is dropping him to try to steal an easy purse? Fine. Let him beat me. If the animal really does have talent, another trainer will be training him soon, and the former trainer won't have to chance to do it again, most likely. Find what generally works for you and remember that you simply can't win 'em all.